If you are currently a Nikon D750 shooter and considering upgrade to the Nikon D780, I'm going to talk about the difference between these two cameras, what has been changed, and what are the improvements that comes with the D780. And if you are also considering the Nikon Z6 and not sure whether you should get the mirrorless camera from Nikon or get the D780, I'm also going to talk about the difference and do some comparison between these three cameras. Good morning everyone, Richard on here. Welcome back to the channel. So today we are going to look at the latest full frame DSLR from Nikon. This is the Nikon D780. It has been a while since Nikon last released a full frame DSLR camera. So let's have a look at the body design of the Nikon D780 and see what has been changed compared to its predecessor D750. Picking up the Nikon D780 immediately reminds me of the D750. It's not really a surprise, after all this is the successor to the D750, and the overall size, design, weight and the layout of the D780 is indeed very similar to the D750. When I first picked up the camera, the first thing I noticed is that the switch for the live view has been moved from the bottom area. You see it on the D750, from the bottom to the top here. And this really makes sense because the live view mode on the D780 is now a lot better than any of the previous Nikon DSLR. So I imagine a lot of people will be using the live view on the D780 a lot more. And then we now have an additional AF on button here, which is in additional to the AE lock button, which is down here. And also another changes is that the ISO button, which used to be one of the button here, I can't really see it here, but now it's been moved to the top here, which really makes sense because this is one of the buttons that I think a lot of people using it a lot. So putting it up right here really make it a lot easier to change the ISO. And then there are two things now is missing on the D780. First is the pop-up flash, which is no longer available on the D780. According to Nikon, this helped them to improve the weather sealing capability of this new camera. And the other thing is at the bottom there is no longer a connector, unlike the D750, which has one here. So that means for the D780 it is not really possible to have a fully functional battery grip for it. But apart from that, the D780 just feels very similar to the D750. It doesn't mean that Nikon actually just reused the body and all the parts from the D750, which is definitely not the case, because if you look at them closely, you notice that pretty much every single part on the camera has been redesigned. For example, if you look at the battery door, the one on the D780 definitely feel and look a lot stronger than the one on the D750. And even the grip feels quite different between these two cameras. To be honest, I can't really tell which one feels better because the grip on the D750 actually already feels fantastic. But now, the one on the D780 has a slightly different shape. I think I may prefer the one on the D780 a little bit more, but I have to say honestly, the grip on both cameras are both excellent. The D780 used two completely different autofocus system, depends on whether you are shooting using the optical viewfinder mode or the live view mode. If you are shooting in the optical viewfinder mode, the D780 uses the 51-point autofocus system, which a lot of Nikon users should be very familiar with, because even the D750 is also using the same 51-point autofocus system. But having said that, Nikon said they have improved the autofocus system by using some algorithm from their flagship camera D5. So you have the same autofocus mode and settings that you can choose when you are taking photo using the single autofocus. The performance is pretty much as expected. It is very good and very accurate. And when you are shooting in the AFC continuous autofocus mode, the tracking is also very good. Have a look at this set of sample files. There are 24 photos that I shot at the maximum burst speed when my son was running towards me. And if you look at all these photos at 100% zoom, I would say 23 of these 24 photos, the focus is exactly spot on. With only one photo, I think the focus was slightly missed, but the photo probably is still quite usable. So I would say the performance is really good, because when I was taking these photos, I was just using my AFS 70-200 f2.8 VR, which is the first generation VR lens. I think that's like 15 years old, so it's probably not the best lens in terms of the autofocus performance. But even with that pretty old lens on the D780, the autofocus performance is still fantastic. However, I did notice there are two limitations when I was shooting those photos. The first thing is the buffer. When I was shooting in the maximum burst speed, which is 7 frames per second, and I was shooting raw file, I could only get a maximum of about 24-25 raw file, and then the buffer will fill up. So that is just a little bit over 3 seconds of continuous shooting. While this is definitely not terrible and already quite a bit better than the D750, the Nikon Z6 or the Nikon D500, they both have a much larger image buffer compared to the D780. The other limitation I noticed is that while the 51-point autofocus point, the coverage area of those autofocus point is exactly the same as all the other Nikon DSLR that using the same autofocus system, but because I have been shooting with a lot of mirrorless camera, especially the Z6, which you can put the autofocus point pretty much anywhere on the frame, even to the very edge of the frame. Compare that with the 51-point autofocus system on the D780, I definitely feel a lot more restrictive in terms of where I can place the autofocus point with the D780. But apart from these two limitations, I was actually very surprised by the results that I got from the D780 when I was using it to shoot some fast action photos. If you are thinking of getting a camera to do a bit of sports photography, I think you won't be disappointed by the D780. And if you really want to place the autofocus point more closer to the edge of the frame, you can just switch to the live view, because when you do that, you got pretty much the same autofocus system as the Nikon Z6. And that is because the Nikon 780 also has the same on-sensor face detection autofocus sensor, just exactly like the Nikon Z6. There are 273 on-sensor face detection sensor, so using that and also some help with the contrast detection, the hybrid autofocus system on the D780 when you are shooting in the live view mode can offer some advantage that the 51-point autofocus system cannot offer. The first advantage is what I have just mentioned before. You can put the autofocus point pretty much anywhere on the frame, even to the edges or the corner. You can still move your autofocus point over there. And the second advantage is that now you can also have the eye or face autofocus mode. So this is pretty much the same that you can find on the Nikon Z6 or a lot of the other latest mirrorless camera in the market. If you are shooting events or portrait, the eye or face autofocus definitely make your life a lot easier. And the third thing is the low light autofocus performance. When you are shooting using the optical viewfinder mode, the autofocus can be done to -3 EV, which is not too bad at all. But if you switch to the live view mode, you can now autofocus down to -5 EV. And look at this little example. So I was taking some photos in this room and I turned off all the lights and I only turn on my aperture light at the minimum setting at 1%. I also point it up to the roof. So the room is very dark. When I was trying to do some autofocus using the optical viewfinder and the 51-point autofocus system, it cannot actually see the target, so it failed to acquire the target. But when I switch to the live view mode, it immediately can lock onto the target. It's very easily managed to lock onto the target, and that was before I switched on the low light autofocus mode, which according to Nikon, if you turn on the low light autofocus mode, you can improve the low light autofocus performance down to -7 EV. So this is like 2 EV better than without turn on the low light autofocus mode, and like 4 EV better compared to the 51-point autofocus mode. So that is pretty ridiculous, because if you have the autofocus at -7 EV, your eyes probably cannot see or can only barely see the target. So with all those advantages that the live view mode autofocus system can offer you, does that mean I should just always shoot with the live view mode? The answer is it depends. If you are just shooting things like portrait or most of the everyday photos, the live view mode is definitely a lot more flexible and easier to use. However, if you are shooting sports or any fast action photos, the improved 51-point autofocus system is still more reliable and more accurate compared to the live view autofocus mode. And also if you are shooting with the optical viewfinder, because the optical viewfinder there is no lag at all, so it would also make it a bit easier for you when you are shooting some fast action photos. And if you are a long-time Nikon shooter and considering between the Z6 and D780, one thing you have to remember is that if you have some of the older AF autofocus lenses, those are the ones that require a in-body autofocus motor, it would still autofocus very well with the D780, just like the D750, because both of these has the in-body autofocus motor, while with the Z6, even with the FTZ adapter, that would not allow any of the older AF lenses to autofocus with the FTZ adapter on the Z6 or Z7 or even the Z50. With this mirrorless camera, you just won't have any autofocus with those older AF lenses. But on the other hand, the newer Z mount lenses, they would only work with the Nikon Z mirrorless cameras. They wouldn't be able to mount on any of the Nikon DSLR, including the Nikon D780. The maximum burst speed for the D780 is 7 frames per second with autofocus and auto exposure, so this is a bit faster than the 6.5 frames per second for the D750 and 5.5 frames for the Nikon Z6. And with both the Z6 and D780, if you don't need the autofocus, you can switch to the live view mode and use the electronic shutter, and you can shoot at 12 frames per second. One thing that some of the D750 shooters complain about is the maximum shutter speed is only 1/4000 seconds. So that means if you are shooting with some fast f1.4 lenses on a bright sunny day, even if you're shooting at the minimum ISO 100, you could still overexpose your photo quite a bit. Now with the D780, Nikon has increased the maximum shutter speed to 1/8000 seconds, so this is exactly the same as all the other flagship Nikon DSLRs. And on the opposite side, the slowest shutter speed that you can go without using any external trigger is now increased from 30 seconds to 900 seconds. This is definitely very handy for landscape or astrophotographer who want to do some really long exposure photos. Next, let's look at the D780's image quality and let's do some comparison with the Z6 and D750. The D750 was really popular. One of the reasons was because of its image quality. It has really good dynamic range and the low light performance is also very good. But it seems Nikon managed to make some noticeable improvement with the D780. So now let's have a look at the JPEG that is directly from the camera. The JPEG from the D780 is very nice, from base ISO even all the way to ISO 25600. The quality is still very good with very minimal noise, and the overall image quality is just fantastic. And even at the ISO 51200, look at this photo and let's look at 200% zoom, you can see that the image quality is still very good. And if we compare it with the JPEG from the D750 shot at the same ISO, the JPEG from the D780 is definitely quite a bit better than the JPEG from the D750. I would say the D780 has around one stop advantage compared to the D750. And if I compare the JPEG from the Z6 and D780 both shot at ISO 51200, you notice that they actually look quite different even though the sensor is supposed to be the same. With both cameras at default setting, it looks like Nikon applied quite a bit stronger noise reduction with the JPEG on the Z6. There is a bit less noise, but at the same time a lot of the finer details also got removed. I personally prefer the JPEG from the D780 because even though there is a little bit more noise, but it also retained a lot more finer detail. To me, the high ISO JPEG from the D780 just look very nice. Let's have a look at this JPEG from the D780 shot at ISO 200,000. While definitely there is quite a bit of noise in this JPEG file, but if you look at the amount of fine detail that it managed to retain, I think it's pretty remarkable how Nikon managed to output such a nice, beautiful JPEG at such a ridiculously high ISO. And now let's have a look at the RAW files. At the lower ISO, the RAW file from all these cameras are very similar. So let's look at ISO 51200, which is the maximum ISO that the D750 can handle. First, let's compare the RAW file from the D780 and the D750. I would say the RAW file from the D780 has a lot less chroma noise, and also the overall contrast seems to be quite a bit better compared to the D750. And even with the noise reduction setting set to 0 in Lightroom, I think the RAW file from the D780 at ISO 51200 is still quite acceptable and very usable. And when I compare the RAW file from the Z6 and the D780, even at very high ISO like 51200 or even higher, I don't really see any noticeable difference between the RAW file from these two cameras. And next, I did another test to see how the RAW file from this camera would respond when I do some extreme push in post-processing. So first, I took a photo at the normal exposure setting just to let you to see how the photo should look like with the normal exposure. And next, I took a set of raw photo with each of these three cameras and all of them at 6 stop underexposed. And this is the result from the D780 after I tried to push 6 stop in post-processing. I would say the overall image quality is still quite acceptable. The contrast, the colors are still quite nice after a 6 stop push in post-processing. And now let's have a look at the result from the D750. You can immediately see there's a big difference in the result I got. The contrast is a lot lower compared to the D780, and also there is some very strong color shift, especially look at the shadow area with the raw file after 6 stop pushing in post-processing. Okay, next let's have a look at the result from the Z6. I think overall the image quality seems to be very similar to what I got from the D780. The contrast seems pretty similar, but look a little bit more, I noticed that there is quite a bit more color shift, the result from the Z6 compared to the D780, which has very minimal color shift. So it looks like Nikon may have improved the sensor or the processing a little bit with the D780 because it's supposed to have the same sensor as the Nikon Z6. And now let's talk about the video recording feature on the D780 and how does it compare to the other two cameras. With the D750, it can only record at full HD resolution, and the autofocus performance in the video mode, let's say it's very limited on the D750. Now with the D780, it can record 4K video and also at 10-bit output, which is significantly better than what the D750 can do. And not only that, because of its new autofocus system, the new on sensor face detection sensor, you have pretty decent autofocus performance, continuous autofocus performance even when you are recording video. And you also have the eye or face autofocus, which really help when you are shooting video. The 4K video recorded by the D780 is very good quality, it's very sharp and also very nice color, and at the base ISO all the way up to medium ISO, the quality of the image is still very good. And even at ISO 25600, the image quality is still pretty good. From ISO 51200 onwards, you would start to see a lot more noise, and also the image quality will start to degrade quite noticeably. At maximum ISO 204,000, the image quality is definitely not very good. You can see a lot of noise, and at the same time a lot of small details got removed by the noise reduction algorithm. But having said that, it still looked a little bit better than the full HD footage that I shot with the D750 at ISO 25600. That means the D780 has at least a 3-stop improvement in the high ISO video quality compared to the D750, even when recorded at the higher output resolution. That is definitely very impressive. And when I compare the video output from the Z6 to the D780, I don't really see much difference between the output from these two cameras. So overall, in terms of the video recording, the D780 and the Z6 are very similar in terms of both the output quality and also feature. The only difference is that the Z6, it has the optional raw video output that you can enable if you send the Z6 to Nikon for a paid firmware upgrade, while the D780 doesn't have this upgradable feature. So if raw video output is really important to you, then the Z6 would be the better camera for you. Oh, there's actually another difference between these two cameras. It's because the Z6 has an in-body image stabilizer, while the D780 does not have any in-body image stabilizer. So what that means is, if you are shooting video using a prime lens or any lens that doesn't have VR, the optical image stabilizer, with the Z6, the in-body image stabilizer would help you to stabilize, smooth the footage a little bit. While with the D780, if you are not using any gimbal or any external device to help stabilize the footage, then you may have a more shaky video footage compared to the Z6. If you ask me what is the biggest disadvantage if you are shooting with a mirrorless camera, even the latest mirrorless camera, I would say it's probably the battery life. Because even with the latest mirrorless camera, the battery life is still nowhere as good as even the average DSLR. With DSLRs, the battery life is just a lot longer, and this is exactly the same for the D780. But because the live view mode on the D780 is actually quite good now, so I found that I actually shoot with the live view mode quite a bit with the D780 and also shot quite a bit of video. So those would actually use up the battery a lot faster than compared to just using the optical viewfinder mode. But even that, I found that the battery can still last me about 3 or 4 days when I'm shooting with a lot of live view mode usage. If I shoot with the same shooting pattern with the Z6, which use the same battery, the battery could probably only last me 1 day. Compare the Z6 with the D780, the D780 battery life is definitely a lot better. These days, I'm mostly a mirrorless camera shooter. I rely on the Z6 for most of my wedding and portrait work, and even when I'm not shooting weddings or portrait, I still mostly shoot with different mirrorless cameras. But you know that special feeling when you met with an old friend that you haven't seen each other for a long time, and that is exactly the feeling that I got when I pick up the D780 and work on this review. There are many things that I really like about mirrorless camera, that's why I say I'm mostly a mirrorless camera shooter these days. But picking up the D780, it immediately reminds me why I love shooting with Nikon DSLR for so many years. The big optical viewfinder with no lag, and also when you click the shutter button, that shutter sound, that sounds fantastic. And also the body design, the ergonomic, the grip, everything that is pretty much perfection after so many generations of refinement that Nikon has been working on. Just picking up and shooting with the Nikon D780, it just reminds me why shooting with the Nikon DSLR, it just feels so good. And now with the new live view mode that is borrowed from the Z6, that is so much better than what any of the previous Nikon DSLR has. It also has a very good video recording feature. So overall, it just feels like a lot more complete and a lot more modern camera compared to the Nikon D750. And if you ask me whether you should get a D780 or a Z6, if you are considering both of these Nikon full frame camera, I would say if you are new to photography or new to Nikon, maybe getting the Z6 is what I would recommend, because it has the new Z mount, which is probably the future of Nikon, which the Z mount does allow Nikon to create some better lenses. As you can see, all the new Z mount lenses, they are all pretty amazing. So if you get the Nikon Z, then you can enjoy those new Nikon lenses. But on the other hand, if you have been a long time Nikon shooter and you're very familiar with the Nikon DSLR and you like the optical viewfinder, or especially if you already have a large selection of Nikon lenses, especially the older AF lenses, then it probably make more sense if you get the D780. Pick it up, you will feel very familiar. Everything is pretty much exactly the same, and all your lenses, the AFS lenses, AF lenses, would work exactly the same as your previous Nikon DSLRs. And also, if you have some of the older manual focus lens, you could also now, using features like peaking and zoom in, you can also manual focus very accurately as well. So you would probably feel a lot more familiar with the Nikon 780, and at the same time you have a taste of what the mirrorless camera would be like, because the live view mode is basically borrowed from the Z6, so you got a taste of the mirrorless cameras. It may help you to prepare yourself for the future when you want to move to the Nikon Z mirrorless camera system. I also heard a few people complaining the price of the D780, because it's true, if you compare it to the price of the D750, it is a lot more expensive. But don't forget that the D750 is like a 5 years old camera, and the price has dropped a lot compared to when it was brand new. The price of the D780 is very similar to the price of the Canon 5D Mark IV. If you look at the spec of the D780 and compare it to the 5D Mark IV, you will notice the spec is actually very similar, and in many ways I think the D780 is actually better than the 5D Mark IV. It has much better video recording feature. The camera is, of course, it is a lot newer and it has a lot more newer technology. If you think of it this way, the price of the D780 is actually quite reasonable. Now, one thing that I would really love to see is if Nikon or maybe some third-party accessory maker, if they release a optional EVF that can attach to maybe the hot shoe, and then you can connect it to the maybe the HDMI output, and then you can shoot it in the live view mode but with the EVF. Now then, that would be the ultimate DSLR. But of course, that is just something that I wish to see and probably will never be there. But even without that, I still think the Nikon D780 is probably the best DSLR in the market right now.